you all for joining us on this chilly February evening. My name is Michael Denhammer, and I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's event, Stories for a Just Transition. So I'm the educational programs for the Center for Community Engaged Learning, which I'll introduce a little bit further in just a minute here. And before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the unceded lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. These nations continue to affirm their sovereignty and jurisdiction over these lands, and it is through this sovereignty and jurisdiction that we must support these nations in their assertion of self-determination to control and manage their ancestral lands, waters, and territories. So the Center for Community Engaged Learning, for those who don't know, is focused on bringing community organizations with their complex and diverse backgrounds and lived experiences together with faculty and students to approach complex societal challenges. We do this by working collaboratively with campus and community partners on programs and initiatives, both on and off campus. During this time, we remain committed to serving our community partners, faculty, and students, and we're proactively pivoting our efforts towards online engagement to ensure continued transformative learning and programming for students, community partners, and be ready when the time calls for community and faculty to find new ways of working together on societal issues that were previously unknown or unexpected. These efforts are undertaken from the perspective that the university as a public citizen plays a critical role in supporting our students, faculty, and community partners to weather the immediate crisis. We are committed to strengthening the resilience and recovery of our community and the sectors that comprise it towards a more just and sustainable society. So the Doing Stories Justice Speaker Series highlights the efforts of individuals, communities, and organizations. Their work recognizes our interdependence and builds power into our communities. Their stories are used to enlighten us, to engender empathy, to connect across difference, and to catalyze social change. This event series is focused on 4 themes: stories of community safety, stories of a just transition, hidden histories, elevating the past for new futures, and radical imagination. Each event will bring together community members, community advocates, and theorists to discuss how they use story in their work. We'll learn about the relational nature of storytelling and listening, and how the speakers bring reciprocity, responsiveness, and intimacy into their work, and how we as listeners do stories justice. So before we start, I just want to provide a bit of a definition for just transition, just so we have a starting point for tonight's conversation. And the definition we're using is from the movement generation. So movement generation defines a just transition as a framework for a fair shift to an economy that is ecologically sustainable, equitable, and just for all its members. Building on that, just transition, a just transition to us represents a set of aligned strategies to transition whole communities towards thriving economies that provide dignified, productive, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods that are governed directly by workers and communities. A just transition requires us to build a visionary economy for life in a way that is different than the economy we are in now. Transition is inevitable, justice is not. So I also want to make sure that you know that there will be time for Q&A for both our speakers, Maya and Avi, tonight. So Sydney, if you want to post the Slido link in the chat. So the website is just sli.do. And then on the top of the website, you'll see an opportunity to type in a hashtag. And in that, you could type in hashtag Cecil. Thank you, Sydney. Okay. So I'll introduce both Maya and Avi, and I'll ask for them to introduce themselves a little bit as well. So I'll keep this very brief. Maya is the Senior Manager of Programming and Development at the Leap. She works directly with folks mobilizing for change in their communities by crafting stories that make transformative change for real people. Her focus is on the intersections of migrant justice, the abolition of borders and racism, and climate justice. And in her unpaid work with No One is Legal in Toronto, Close the Camps Coalition, and as a climate justice intervener at the UNFCCC. She's currently based in Takaranto on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. You can follow her on Twitter at Maya Lillian M. which if you follow us on Twitter as well, which is at UBC Cecil, you'll actually be able to follow the live tweets for the event. And please do quote anything that you found relevant for tonight. And Avi is the co-founder and strategic director of The Leap. He started his career in Toronto in 1990 as a local news reporter, reporting on fires, food bank drives, propane leaks, and city council meetings. Later, he hosted a show on City TV called New Music and got to interview some of his heroes like David Bowie and Leonard Cohen, who actually is a Leap Manifesto signer. And in the late 90s, hosted a show called Counterspin on CBC, where he burned out, hosting more than 500 live televised debates in 3 years. Yeah, we could have a whole separate conversation about burnout as well, I imagine, especially in this work on climate change. So he also launched a documentary show on Al Jazeera called Fault Lines, and made a few other documentaries, The Take and This Changes Everything. And together, Maya and Avi co-host the Change Everything podcast, which has hosted brilliant speakers and thinkers such as Ronaldo Walcott, Kianga Yamada Taylor, and Daniel Adana Cohen, among others as well. Avi and Maya, welcome.
Hi there.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you and for the conversation tonight. So why don't we just jump right into it? And so I'll start with you, Maya. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and some of the work that you're currently focused on?
Totally. So I'm actually now the program director at The Leap, and the work that I focus on is kind of around the intersections of care work. So care work as already low carbon, hugely gendered work that we consider climate work, as it is the vital work of caring for each other, which will take us through the great transition. And so it's those intersections that I work at now. Avi, who are you? Besides being a VJ, I think, which was missing from your bio, which I just felt important.
So we're not going to be discussing the finer points of who is a VJ and who is a music journalist, because I'm over that. I mean, obviously, It was a very long time ago.
Right.
Maya and I haven't seen each other for a whole hour, you guys, since we were in our last meeting together. So forgive the wanton banter. Working at The Leap over the last 5 years, we basically we've launched a whole series of different projects that focus exactly on this area of just transition. The Leap and the Leap Manifesto in 2015, which we can talk more about later if people are interested and aren't that familiar with it, was a political document that kind of channeled demands that were coming from social movements across a huge spectrum of issues into a vision, not a singular vision, but like a harmony of voices and political needs and constituencies that were looking at what would it take to get to a more just society, including one that is safe and fair for everyone, which in a time of climate emergency means slashing emissions in half in a decade and to zero quickly after that, and using that massive shift in all of our interlinked systems in society to bring about more justice, to systematically confront white supremacy and economic inequality and corporate control of our government and all the other crises that we face. So we've done a whole bunch of different projects. We've worked in Alberta with folks who are looking at how the oil and gas workers in the tar sands could have generations of work remediating the land that extraction has poisoned and contaminated, and the hundreds of thousands of abandoned oil and gas wells and the land that needs to be healed. We've worked on projects with Indigenous partners, like the Tiny House Warriors, on how there are solutions that have been around for hundreds of generations that need to be remembered and re-implemented. We've worked with We've looked at the Green New Deal from a lot of different angles. We've done lots of little videos about what a Green New Deal looks like in specific ways. But overall, I think our work has been about trying to make this better future tangible, trying to tell stories that bring what we're fighting for to life for people, which is, we've tried a whole bunch of different things. Some of them work better than others. But Maya and I inhabit those intersections among all the different issues and telling stories fundamentally about how to bring them about.
And the stories are so good, and we'll get into them a little bit more in a little bit here. But for those who don't follow all of the work at the Leap, most recently the two that I'm most familiar with are the Messages from the Future Part 1 and Part 2, and we'll make sure that those links are sent out to everyone in the audience tonight as well. That's great. So Maya, what called you into this work? So coming from your background more focused on migrant justice and migrants' right work, how did you end up at the Leap and bringing more climate focus to your work?
Yeah, well, I actually worked as a fundraiser for about a decade. So I did that, kind of building fundraising campaigns and then campaign strategy for different organizations. And I actually hired the person who used to be the operations director at the Leap to run an anti-O training for me. And she said, the anti-O at this organization you're working at isn't really going well. Do you want to work somewhere else? And then a month later, I was at the Leap. So that was really great. But I actually started getting involved in climate through divestment campaigns at U of T. And then I ended up doing climate interventions at the COP summits for a couple of years in a row. And it was actually at COP when we were it was in Marrakesh in 2016 when the Paris Agreement just started crumbling before our eyes. I think we were a day into the climate talks when the election results were coming in the early hours of the morning. And so many of my friends were dropping their work as we were leaving, and we're flying out of Casablanca, and people were either getting on flights directly to Standing Rock, where the Army Corps were expected in about a day, or flying straight to the Mediterranean to do crisis intervention during the ongoing refugee crisis there. And that's when I kind of realized that I wanted the intersections of my climate work to actually be about borders, because we were in a world where I was in sessions where people were no longer talking about keeping temperature rise under 1.5. We were talking about who could be saved in the new world and what was going to happen. And I thought, borders are going to be really big here. And we're having a debate about who deserves to survive, then the answer has to be all of us. And I thought that big battle would actually happen at borders all over the world. And so I actually joined No One Is Illegal. I applied on the plane on the way back to Toronto and haven't left since. And the wonderful thing about working at the Leap, kind of touching on what Evie was saying about all the intersections that we work at, is that I was really encouraged to bring that politic to work and to figure out ways to integrate it into the work that we were doing. And so when did we do the migration video, Evie?
A year and a half ago, 2 years ago. No, a year and a half. It was 2019, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So
what is time?
Yeah.
I don't even know.
Yeah. What is
March for
how many
year.
decades? How many decades ago was that?
But when the refugee crisis was really eclipsing the news again, we decided, let's do a really big deep dive into what is happening in this country and what it means to actually operate within a spirit of internationalism and reject the concept of borders everywhere as a climate solution. And it was a really beautiful thing to be able to bring that work to this organization and merge those worlds together. So that's how I kind of started more and more building that into all aspects of my work. That was a really wonderful opportunity to be able to do.
Yeah, thank you. Such a thoughtful response. Avi, can you top Maya's response and talk about what called you into the climate change work? Because I know some of your historical work has been so focused on globalist issues, but in climate specifically.
Well, I was thinking as Maya was telling that powerful story that I should maybe just turn off my video and let her take it. No, I do kind of get under a spell listening to Maya speak. And I think that there are moments in your life when you feel this call. And so I really appreciate the framing of your question. I had a whole first career in journalism, as you said, riffing on my bio. And I sort of came of age politically in the late 90s, in my early 20s, around the globalization battle. So some of you may remember, and some of you may have studied, and some of you may not have heard of this big thing that happens in Seattle in 1999. where there was a meeting of the World Trade Organization, and there was an upwelling, there was an emergence of a global movement against the kind of globalization that was really being locked in. And the consumption-based global economy that we have today, with these long supply chains, with most of the world's manufactured goods being made in China and consumed in a few rich countries, this was all locked in the late 90s. And the pandemic has really exposed the weaknesses of that system in so many different ways, as the climate crisis does. But for my generation of political activists, we sort of hit the streets in the globalization debate of the late 90s. And I was hosting this talk show on CBC News World, where the show basically launched the week of the WTO meetings. And what we were doing, instead of covering the broken glass and the protesters and all this hyperbolic mainstream, pearl clutching around property damage, which eclipsed the massive tectonic changes, which were altering the nature of the global economy and putting so many people on the receiving end of these policies, people who were being flooded with, subsidized agricultural goods from the United States that were destroying the conditions for farming in Mexico and Central America and Latin America, huge parts of the world where people were being pushed off their land by these free trade policies and forced to move. And a source of a lot of the migration on Earth today were those policies that were put in place in the 90s. And I was weirdly like a lefty, a known leftist, given this show on CBC News World to debate those big issues of the day. So we debated the policies of so-called free trade and globalization. And that was a real, it was an exciting moment where global movements were linking together through confronting this crisis of the imposition of these policies. And it was also the time when the climate crisis was just like first on the radar of, when the Kyoto process and all those things were getting started. And I was late to the climate game. It was really like in 2008, 2009, when I finally started fully grokking the enormity of the climate emergency, and have really only been working on it full-fledged for the last sort of dozen years. Some people may know that my partner in life and work and all things is writer Naomi Klein. And Naomi and I went to Bolivia in 2009 after the disaster that was the Copenhagen Climate Summit. And we went to the first social movement gathering that the Bolivian government hosted to confront the climate crisis from a social movement point of view, from a bottom-up point of view, and to talk about the rights of Mother Earth and not the rights of corporations. And while we were there, I did a piece for Fault Lines, the Al Jazeera show that I was hosting. Naomi wrote an article, and it was the beginning of this long project that we did called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, which is kind of self-explanatory. But I do remember this one moment where so folks that we were working with wanted to show us something, and we drove up this glacier, which was a really rough road because the glacier for thousands of years had been like crushing the rock, and we're bouncing up in this Jeep. We get to the top, and there's this little ski resort, which just 2 years earlier was like the highest ski resort in the world with a lift. And it was utterly abandoned. And the resort and the ski lift looked out over just bare rock. And in the matter of just like the previous 5 years, the entire glacier had melted away, that part of it. And there was just this ghostly abandoned ski resort. And it was hard to breathe because it was so high up outside of La Paz, which is a really high altitude place. And it just like the fact of the changing world with these fading murals of like, kind of like romantic skiers, outside of the capital in Bolivia, just was like, holy crap, this is like so happening in real time. And it was a moment for me when I knew there was no turning back from climate, not necessarily as a single issue at all, but as an overarching framing issue for the rest of my life's work. You notice that Maya answers much more succinctly. This is a pattern that we have where.
What kind of comparison answer is that? I was on a plane. You're like, so we're on the top of the glacier. We're looking out over the glacier.
Your people were going to the Mediterranean.
Whatever.
They were for Standing Rock.
Yeah, it's well, thank you for also a thoughtful response, Abby. We won't make everybody here vote on which one was better because they were both so wonderful.
Don't want to see the results of the poll.
No need
Thank
to.
you.
We're not competitive.
At all.
I'm the least competitive.
I'll also quickly plug, we have some extension resources that always go out after these events. And your Bolivia comment reminded me that one of the extension podcasts for this event is Tea Riofrancos talking about climate radicals and the work of the pink wave in South America for thinking about the just transition in a fully different way. So I'll make sure that goes out to everyone, and it's highly worth a listen, and the book is absolutely incredible as well. Okay, so Abby, my next question is for you. Giving us a bit of a history on Leap, and when Leap turned to focusing on the framing around a Green New Deal.
So the Leap Manifesto was a political document that we released in September of 2015. It was a result of dozens of different community organizations and movement groups that came together to articulate this response to the intersecting crises of climate, of economic inequality, of white supremacy, of discrimination of all forms. And it made a bit of a splash when it launched in September 2015. We had a lot of high profile signatories. We had a reading of the text of the manifesto by a bunch of kind of elders, my dad, Stephen Lewis, and David Suzuki and Maud Barlow, as well as Melina Labucan Massimo, who had just launched an important indigenous solar project in her people's territory in the tar sands. So like the alternative really being put in the path of the extractive machine. George Eliot Clark was there, the great poet, and a bunch of other folks. And then we had all these signatories. And like you mentioned, there were hundreds of high profile folks who signed, and Neil Young and Rachel McAdams and Elliot Page and many others. And then 50,000 Canadians who put their names to this document, which at the time was sort of considered this radical eco-futurist vision document. In fact, now 5 years later, it seems not tame exactly, but kind of common sense, as I think the debates have really caught up a lot. A big part of the debates catching up was the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Those are the world's great climate scientists who advise the world's governments on in the international climate negotiations process. And the IPCC report in 2018 that described the difference between a 2-degree warming world and a 1.5 degree warming world was really, really dramatic. And the sentence that was world changing in that was, the scientists said, it was actually in the press release for the policy, the report to policymakers, that said keeping the world to 1.5 degrees of warming, which is a vast difference in terms of how many millions of people will be safe, will have food security, will have water, and the possibility of a dignified life, would require rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in every aspect of society. And that idea that every aspect of society needs fundamental change was what we had tried to articulate in the Leap Manifesto in 2015, and is really the core of the Green New Deal that emerged in 2018, 2019 in the United States with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Sunrise Movement, and has really taken the global climate movement I think, has had an impact on it in integrating social justice and the fights against white supremacy and inequality as the heart of the climate movement rather than an add-on. So the Leap Manifesto was kind of Green New Deal 1.0 in some ways. And I think the thing that really characterizes our work is trying to name the excitement of the opportunity to unite struggles and to have a vision of the intersecting crises being met by intersecting solutions that really echo intersecting movements, leading, or as Naomi likes to say, grabbing the wheel of history and actually changing course in terms of the values that govern our society. And this kind of like big change for big crises frame is what we kind of piloted it with the Leap Manifesto, and now we see it in many, many different places. Of course, we didn't invent it, and the Leap itself was a very communal expression that was written by dozens and dozens of activists and put out as a collective. And the ideas have been around for generations, and particularly the notion of just transition and the kind of the Leap frame has come from the global South. It was Bolivia's climate negotiator and dozen years ago who was talking about a Marshall Plan for planet Earth. And of course, the ideas of living in a healthier relationship with the natural world are the legacy of hundreds of generations of indigenous wisdom. So they really are just surfacing of tendencies that have been around for a really long time.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And I hope that was really helpful for everyone in learning some of the history of that. And the framing of a Green New Deal is really, really bringing in a lot of a labor focus to that as well. So Maya, you mentioned a lot in your introduction, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of your work in migrant justice. So there's two key pillars to this work, which are borders and immigration policies, and the second on justice for migrant workers who actually might already be in Canada. Could you share why both of these pillars are so important to climate justice and a just transition?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the second one, justice for migrant workers, actually kind of sits on the first two. And I would say that, migrant justice is really about rejecting the concept of borders at its core. And immigration is just the system that allows that to continue, the solidification of borders on stolen land. So in migrant justice, we say a lot that, no body can be illegal on stolen land. And fundamentally, the rejection of borders is really a rejection of colonialism and a rejection of imperialism. And so rejecting borders fundamentally then says, then what does it mean to be illegal? How does one become illegal? And that's what immigration systems and immigration policies are about. They're about creating tiered citizenship that allows capitalism to run rampant. So a body can cross a border, a body cannot cross a border rather, but labor can. And that's what our immigration policies in Canada are set up to do. And that's why we're actually operating within this framework and the calls for justice right now around migrant workers specifically. That's such a fascinating part of the pandemic for me. And I think it's been something that's really why a lot of migrant organizers are jumping on a campaign that has been whispered about in organizing rooms for decades, which is regularization and status for all. And yeah, that language of landed is complicated because when we say landed status now, that means we want status for everyone on arrival. But ultimately, the call is no one should be illegal crossing a border from a colonial nation. So yeah, that's kind of like where a lot of the work sits. In terms of what it means to reject borders right now, I feel like we're in a very exciting conversation about it. And we're on the edge of kind of winning this thing. There's a national campaign right now for status for all. We have federal ministers commenting on it. We're talking about rolling out regularization campaigns sector by sector, where workers are first to get status immediately. And then we're having the conversation of, we shouldn't even have to go through that battle again. Why are people still applying for status? So, I mean, I've been talking a lot about this because I don't know if people were aware of this, but when the pandemic hit, Trudeau basically closed the borders to migrant workers, agricultural workers. And migrant agricultural workers in this country, and I'm going to touch on a little bit of this because I'm sad that Evelyn's not here, but migrant workers, agricultural workers in this country make up about 70%, over 70% of the workforce on farms. And so, of course, when the border closed, the entire agricultural sector in this entire country fell to its knees overnight. And so you wouldn't even notice that Trudeau quickly reversed that decision to allow migrant workers to come in again, as if everything was fine. But of course, migrant workers in this country are exempt from almost every conceivable labor law. They're not protected in any way on work in the work that they're doing. Many people are treated horribly by their employers. And don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to emergency services, are essentially barred and policed from accessing almost every type of essential service that they should get access to as human beings. But somehow, while all of this money is being funneled into preventing people who are basically keeping us all alive, growing our food, taking care of our kids with the really infamous live-in caregiver program in Canada, and still, and also, I mean, another side of that I was talking about recently is there was in 2016, I was referring to the crisis in the Mediterranean. There was another crisis happening the year after that, where migrants were walking when Trump's election was happening, walking across the border into Canada, largely at Roxton Road, but also outside of Winnipeg, in the snow, losing limbs, holding kids in their arms to get access to Canada and being denied at the border because we're still holding the Safe Third Country Agreement in place. And now I was writing an article on this about a month ago. Tons of the migrants who walked across the border at Roxton Road in Quebec are now working in long-term care facilities in Montreal. So many so that there are now agencies working on temp programs to get migrants who don't have status, who don't have access to healthcare, who are being denied vaccines, who can't get access to a food bank, who are not being given housing, are working in the worst hit long-term care facilities in this country and still are not getting status. So it takes this incredible amount of infrastructure, of money to maintain a system that maximizes the amount of labor that can be extracted from folks without status, while minimizing all protections that they have access to. And fundamentally, this is a climate issue. We're talking about creating tiered immigration systems to create, rungs of dignity that will be awarded to people based on white supremacy and all types of supremacy. And if we can start to unpack that and actually dismantle it from the root outwards, we can actually really have a conversation about what it would mean to fight for everyone to survive, which is the climate justice call, that we all deserve to survive and also to thrive. So that's kind of how both of those have been so knitted together for me, but it's also been a really wonderful on-ramp to talking about how policing is deeply a part of climate justice, how policing fundamentally props up borders. I was talking a little bit about the infrastructure that goes into marginalizing migrants. We filed a Freedom of Information request about 3 years ago. And we found out that the border services agencies and police in this country make 10,000 phone calls to each other a year, which is ridiculous. They're not supposed to be working together. But these systems, just to make sure that migrants can't get access to essential services, that is part of our police system. And so all these systems support each other. And so what would it mean if instead of funding all of those systems that further marginalize folks who are providing life-saving support to our community members, who have been our community members for decades upon decades, who shouldn't be made illegal as they cross borders, what if we actually just stopped spending money blocking them from getting access to being treated like human beings, and instead funneled money into things like greening our cities and making public transit free, and talking about making affordable food systems that everyone can have access to and paying people living wages. And so it's been really rewarding to get to dig into those intersections with the climate lens and actually tap them all as climate issues and help people connect those dots. I feel like half my job now is just sitting in front of a whiteboard going, it's all connected with a red marker. But it's also really great to be able to say all those things together. And also it seems like that's clicking for people, maybe for the first time in the years that I have been in migrant justice, that people understand that those are interwoven. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, yeah.
The pandemic has just been such a terrifyingly effective teacher.
Yeah.
I feel like this has been, the light that is glaring on all of these systems of extraction and oppression, and the nature and what you said was so powerful in just remembering that the people who are being denied basic rights as workers and as humans, being denied access to essential public services, are in fact the essential workers that people are going out onto their balconies to applaud in the pandemic. So it's been like a year of endless teachable moments in terms of like, what is essential? What do we need to survive? Who's getting it to us? Who's, and this is why in our message foams, we started the second one essentially with hands. As we were washing our hands and washing our hands and washing our hands a year ago, we started thinking, who touched what I'm touching? Who touched this box before I did? And that actually was like, right, who brought this box to my door? Who put the food in the box? Who grew the food that got put in the box that got brought to my door? Every single one of those people is an essential worker who probably doesn't have access to all of the rights afforded others in society. And so, the connections have unfortunately been inscribed in illness and death on the body of the society. And it's really made all of these things more urgent and also more clear. And I feel like the connections among all of the different issues, when the pandemic is over, and it will be one day, I think the scars from it will last a really long time. But when it's over, like, will we still remember what we learned in this moment? And that's why stories are of ultimate fundamental importance, because the stories we tell then, based on the stories that we tell each other now, are the way that we will save the lessons that we learned and bring them into the next reality. Because otherwise, their forces to return to a toxic business as usual will come right out and slam the door shut on everything that we achieve together in tenderness, in connection, in understanding, and enlightenment in this terrifying time. And we need to be ready with stories to prop that door open so that we actually come out into the light from this time.
Totally. Yeah, and in Vancouver, it was very clear right from the beginning. The places with the greatest inequities were those who were hit hardest by COVID. It was migrant agricultural workers in Delta, in Kelowna, in the Okanagan. It was people in prisons who didn't have access to any health services, to any ability to be safe in those moments. And I mean, it's the hardest teacher of all, but thank you for saying that so eloquently, both Maya and Avi. So Maya, and you touched on this in your intro and a little bit in what you just shared as well. And you wrote a really brilliant essay, I guess I'll call it, or article in the Briar Patch in January. I was wondering if you could just elaborate, in what ways is care work low carbon work, and how is that so important to the framing of a future that we all want to live in?
Yeah, definitely. Love talking about that. Yeah, I think I was sitting in, I was remembering all the protests in the summer last year, and watching kind of the frustration that's built as everyone had to go back into inside as the winter hit, and the nervousness about what it meant to gather. And I was thinking a lot, I was speaking on some panels where people were like, oh, it feels like we haven't mobilized in so long, and I don't even remember what that was like, and what was the last protest that you were at? And I kept thinking back to February of 2020 and remembering that in the wake of the climate strikes, which just saw numbers that I have not seen in a very long time of young people, mostly teenagers, coming out into the street to mobilize. Just a few months after that, young people basically shut down all the arteries of this country for Wet'suwet'en. And that was just in February. I remember standing on train tracks with thousands of people, and people not being able to get on trains to go to cities nearby, and the food supply was changing, like the arteries of the state shut down. And in the weeks after all of those lockdowns, we were sitting in discussions with organizers in the US who were going, oh my God, we were watching what was happening in Canada and going, there has been schism in what we think is actually politically possible and how we mobilize for action right now, because you can shut a country down and set some demands out and reach a different type of mobilization. I was thinking about the police a lot after the summer of that, where we kind of gingerly came out into the street, and then a movement has just like swept the world. And then I was thinking about how the Panama Papers just kind of disappeared. Like no one started talking about it again. And meanwhile, we're watching Jeff Bezos's income just explode, and billionaires in Canada just raked in, I think in the pandemic, like $37 billion in additional wealth on top of the money they already had. Meanwhile, my friends are talking with their clients about whether or not they're choosing food or housing that month and what that was going to mean. I was like, oh my God, this is so connected. And how do you even start to draw those connections? And it was a little bit easier because of the Leap, we've been talking about this for a really long time. But the pandemic, yes, as Abby was saying, has really just laid it bare. And I was trying to think about in that article, I was like, how do I connect this? How do we like talk about these battles as all being the exact same thing? And so care work, as we frame it, is it's the work of caring for each other, and in caring for each other, caring for the planet. That's the work of teachers, of custodians, about all the people working in our grocery stores, gig economy workers, food delivery folks, childcare experts, and personal support workers. Like this is the work of caring for each other. It is often gendered, already low carbon, and it could have gotten us into a way less sticky situation from this pandemic if we hadn't systematically gutted it and then hit it with austerity for decades upon decades upon decades. We actually didn't have to be in this mess. There was no reason that we were, except for greed. And so why was everybody suffering? And why are we convincing teachers, where we have clear science that is definitively telling us that kids are spreading this disease and not getting sick, this virus, we're asking teachers to risk their lives and risk the lives of their students for what? For why? Like, why don't we have enough funds to provide access to different people? Why are parents actually needing to send their kids to school? And a lot of people do because they can't afford childcare. Why is that happening? That makes absolutely no sense. And so caring for each other is really about strengthening our bonds with each other and strengthening us to be able to withstand shocks that are going to keep coming. Of course, pandemics are going to become a fairly regular occurrence. This is not going to be the first one that we're going to be in. It's probably not even going to be the worst. And are we actually putting the measures in place so that caring for each other, which we know is profitable and helps everybody, in place now? And so that's where we've been kind of trying to dig into the intersections and actually run and support campaigns that are trying to overhaul this deep devaluing of the labor that is caring for each other. In a lot of ways, migrant work is that. It is the work of caring for each other. It is migrant women, mostly racialized migrant women who are working in all levels of care work in this country and still not afforded the protections or dignity that any type of worker or person should have access to. And what does it mean to actually value the work, not only the workers who are carrying out this work, but actually value all of us who access it, because we all access care work in one way or another, or in 7 ways in another. So that's kind of like what care work is, how we're defining care work, how I would define care work, and why it is inherently climate work, low carbon work. I can say that 1,000 times in different ways. I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. And it reminds me.
I always like, did I hit all the points? And check me.
Yeah. And thinking about the most recent message from the future, the years of repair, and like the reparation of like relationship as well is so essential in that care work, and how we care for each other and how we support each other in surviving. Seems so increasingly connected to climate justice as well. So one last question for you, Maya, before Abby, I have a few questions for you. This one is, and you mentioned that there's some movement actually already happening around a national campaign for status for all, that some MPs are starting to sign on to it. Like, what are the pieces that are moving in that, and what do you see as missing to for success to happen, or are we on our way to that?
Well, I think the calls for action have been out there for a while, but the status for all basically means full immigration status for all. And if you have access to full immigration status, you have access to all of the labor protections that come associated with that. So instead of battling it out for migrant workers to be treated a little bit more humanely, we should say everyone should be treated humanely, and there should be no tiered access to labor regulations and labor protections. And I think that's the very exciting call that's happening, because if we don't have a tiered immigration system in this country, then we don't have tiered access to essential services. And making sure that everyone has access to all essential services in this country really is the ask. And the entry point for us for that is status for all and regularization, where nobody lives in this weird limbo of actually not being considered a full person. And so that campaign is being led by the Migrant Rights Network, which is a network of many, many, many different migrant worker-led collectives across the country, who have been mobilizing workers and also folks who are not working, because we all deserve to have access to those protections and to be treated with dignity. And so the Migrant Rights Network is leading that call to action. So you can actually sign up for their Status for All campaign at migrantrights.ca. And there are different actions that you can participate in, but the call for action, especially as we head into this federal election, is that we should have status for all. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so Abby, I wanted to talk a little bit about the two most recent films that you co-wrote. So the first, A Message from the Future Part 1, the second, Message from the Future Part 2. The first one, for those who haven't seen it, was with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, co-writing and narrating. And the second one was co-written with Opal Tometi, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And for those who haven't seen it, they're these really beautiful watercolor, like 8-minute vignettes of talking about now as if it was the past. So they're in some like indeterminate future, and about the pieces that that came together to start to build a different future. And they're just two of the most like favorite pieces of art I've seen lately. And I know the first one actually was nominated for an Emmy. I hope the second one is nominated for an Emmy too, or maybe it's too late, maybe this year. And I wanted to ask you, Abby, how have you seen imagination as being really important in storytelling as well, to imagine new futures?
Thank you for that. And I as a filmmaker, I had a long career in television, and television kind of sucks. I started as a local news reporter, and there's not a lot of creativity or truth that you can convey when you have 90 seconds and you're sort of stuck in the vocabulary of news. And I was in my early 20s, and I didn't really I didn't sense my own potential to try totally different things. So when I look back at my work from that time, it's pretty embarrassing. It's so easy when you work in the media to say stuff that other people are saying, because you won't get in trouble if you just sort of take the line that everyone else is taking. And I did this. I have a lot of deep critique of how I started my career and the structures and frames and stories and narratives that I was a part in kind of perpetuating. Now, I was sort of known as like the bleeding heart in the newsrooms. They would give me the food bank stories, and I did some important stories, really important to me, and that really struck a chord with the audience, about a refugee family whose claim had been denied and were being deported. And it was an Eritrean mother and 3 kids. The kids were born in Canada, or 2 of them were. So the government of Canada said, your kids are welcome to stay. You have to leave. And I was like, just telling that story, it just exposes so many of the things that Maya's put so beautifully in this conversation so far. But that was sort of the extent storytelling that was available to me as a local news reporter. And I tried out a bunch of different things, eventually got into long format documentaries. I made two feature length films. The first one took me 4 years. The second one took me 6 years. So really long, deep projects, forming deep relationships in communities. All the feature length films that I've made have been portraits of communities in struggle. And there's a really deep and important piece around accountability when a community struggle trusts you, particularly as a white guy from a rich country, to tell that story. And it has to be a relationship of accountability, because the advantage to a community in the global South or a marginalized or historically marginalized community of getting the story told in a more mainstream space is you can reach many more people with your reality and with your analysis. And I've tried to use my access to mainstream spaces to do that. But it's so easy to get it wrong with all of the embedded privilege and perspectives and mainstream perspectives that exist in me as a product of who I am and the time and the place where I was born and all the advantages I was given. And so you really need these deep relationships. And when you get into relationship with people, when you're making a documentary film, it means not marching in with the camera on and saying, "Give me your story," right? Which is how you're taught to do it. But actually going in there in humility and just listening for a really long time, asking a lot of questions. For my first film in Argentina, it meant learning the language. I went down to Argentina without, a sentence of Spanish, and learned how to speak in a pretty brutal way, but learned how to speak about ideas, about liberation, in factories with workers who were trying to get something essential through my thick head. And I finally asked the translator to just step aside so we could try to connect to each other. And so the question of imagination is how you learn to actually embrace another reality and then take on the sacred responsibility and heavy duty task of communicating it to a wider audience. And so the storyteller in the case of the kind of work that I've done is very much an intermediary. And it requires a lot of humility and a lot of listening and a huge amount of learning before you can start turning it around and expressing it. In that process of making documentary films and working on television in a lot of pretty traditional formats, talk shows, TV docs, stuff like that, I started to feel a little bit hemmed in by how literal it all was, and kind of how rational and how kind of just, I don't know, is it left brain or right brain, but the explainy part, and wanting to touch a nerve that was more artistic, that could touch other parts of people. I believe that we are made of stories, and that we make our stories and our stories make us. This is a fundamental truth. And the ability to sort of make an argument or describe things in discursive terms is not the whole human self, where stories originate or where stories are received. And art takes us out of that box of rationality and politics, with a big P, into the world of the nuance and depth and texture and complexity of human experience. So when we started, actually it was in a project called Delivering Community Power, which the Leap kind of co-wrote and launched with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, where we were describing the postal service as the fundamental public service, one of our oldest and most cherished public services, has this huge network, retail and logistics and distribution network. There's more post offices than Tim Hortons in Canada, many more. So what if the post office were a hub for community-owned energy, for green transition, for local food, for caregiving as a public service? What if the postal service was the infrastructure of that helped us transition to a new, cleaner, and more just economy? And in that piece, we wrote a little story. One of our colleagues, Katie McKenna, actually wrote the story of this person walks into a post office and they notice the solar panels on the roof when they're going inside. And there's a made in Canada electric delivery van where some postal workers are loading in local food. And they get in and people are wearing khaki green jackets or whatever. And there's a map on the wall of how much energy is community owned in the community, and how many, how much electricity is being produced under local control. That's clean energy. And like we tried to like do this little futuristic vignette, and it just worked so well to help people imagine the things that are kind of dry abstract policies when you say for 50% renewable by 20 blah blah, and it's like it doesn't mean anything to anyone. Around the time of the Green New Deal, when it was really emerging in 2018, a great writer named Kate Aronoff wrote a piece in The Intercept that started with a similar kind of gimmick. She was like, I want to tell you a story about, I can't remember the name of a young woman who, it's 2030, and she's just graduated from the, climate corps, where she was, resuscitating wetlands. And, so she told the story of the Green New Deal through the lens of one person, and the story of their life, an invented story that was told in a documentary form. So it was kind of this great culture jam of fiction and nonfiction vocabulary with a fictional substance, but very much an intentional one, not like a magical one, but these specific things that she was describing in this person's life were policies that people are fighting for in communities right now. So the federal jobs guarantee, which is a signal demand of the Green New Deal in the United States, would be the mechanism whereby young people could go and remediate wetlands and do salmon restoration in a place like salmon stream restoration in a place like British Columbia, or taking apart pipelines and cleaning up bayous in coastal Louisiana, a place which is deeply poisoned by oil and gas development of 100 more years. And so this was like the spark for the first message film. And we got together with The Intercept, which is like a media outlet where Naomi works. And they were like, well, it'd be great if we could get AOC to like narrate it. And I was like, yeah, that'd be pretty great. And then Molly Crabapple, who is the extraordinary revolutionary artist and an incredible writer and radical thinker, has this very special form of visual storytelling that she does. And then they got AOC, and they had Molly and a political outfit and a journalistic outfit, and they were like, so there's an art thing, there's a politics thing, and there's a journalism thing. We need someone who can speak to all these different worlds and speak these different languages and make sure that everybody's okay with the piece. And that's how I ended up getting called in to write the narration. And I wrote this piece that, of course, I'm incredibly proud of, this beautiful piece that was all about the beautiful future. And I sent it into AOC's, comms person, and didn't hear back for weeks, and texting and bugging them, and like finally, it was just the visionary part, right? And I was in my office at home one day, and I got a FaceTime call from the guy, AOC's comms guy. I'm like, oh, finally, I'm going to get an answer. So I'm like, why is he calling me on video? And I punched the button, and it's AOC on my phone, and she's in her office, and she's like, hi, okay, so read the script. It's it's good, it's fine, but I think what we need to do is talk about how we got here to where we are now, the present, which is this incredible historic fork in the road. We are either going down the road to like the apocalyptic, wasteland, or we choose this better future. And then you can have like your beautiful green dream thing, like, that you want to do. I'm like, okay, rewrite, back to the drawing board. Got it. And went back and did a 3-act structure, which the film ended up being, which was completely her, notes. And then started receiving, they would print out the script for her, and it would take 7 or 8 weeks, but I'd finally get it back. And it would be a photograph of my latest draft printed out, and her like scribbling, and like, I have, like all of her notes, like, and I'm enlarging the photograph on my screen to try to read like how she's rewriting the thing. So it ended up being very collaborative, but the imagination part was to invoke the reality of the future. And the way to do that made sense was to put her in the future looking back. And that also allowed her, I think, really important instinct as a much bigger public education project to actually teach people about the climate crisis, how long we've known, how long the fossil fuel industry obfuscated and filled the air with information pollution around climate skepticism and denial, and merely naming the moment in 2018 when we know we have to change everything, and then getting to the part which is really exciting and beautiful. And so that collaborative process unlocked an imaginative vision with the art from Mali, with the politics of AOC, with some of the words that I was able to pull together that came out of all of these movement demands that we have been channeling and working with and trying to communicate at the Leap and in my work before. And this piece struck a chord and, was viewed over 12 million times by people all over the world. And so I think that was really an incredible signal to me as a creative person that we have to take a leap artistically. We have to take a leap culturally to find new ways of storytelling, new forms that can suit the new stories that we need, because we are suffering under the weight of these old stories that fossil fuels are going to be around, that so little is possible, that big change never really happens, that we don't have the money to do it in a rich country like Canada. And we need new stories and new forms of storytelling if we're going to get out from under the old ones before they kill us all. So the role of imagination, it can't be overemphasized in its liberatory capacity to unleash, the revolutionary imagination, but also the political practice of bringing it into being. I think imagination is the renewable fuel that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Avi. And it reminds me of so many abolitionists have that conversation of the importance of imagination as well, and that as we're dismantling, we're rebuilding, and imagination is fuel for our just futures. Yeah. So I did have two more questions, but I always don't leave time for audience questions. So I'm going to invite Sydney to share some of the questions that have come in. So Sydney, if you're free, if you want to introduce yourself, and we can get started with a few questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Avi and Maya, for your amazing insights so far. It's been really interesting to hear about different forms of storytelling, how we can embrace more creative processes for storytelling, as well as hearing more about intersections with care work and migrant work as well. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to use the first little moment here to remind everyone to go to the Slido and remember to post your questions and upvote the questions you like, as those are the ones we're most likely to have time for. So going to the Slido, our first most upvoted question is, how do you balance bringing stories about intersectional issues like climate justice to life while respecting the ownership of those narratives? So I'll start with Maya, and I'll post this question in the chat as well.
Thanks for all the links too, Sydney. For
yeah, no problem.
Really, really awesome.
Yeah, I think I'm always advocating for people to get involved in coalition work, because it feels like a very scary thing to involve yourself in. And I did see a tweet the other day that was like, keep your friends close and your enemies in coalitions. And while that's true in the funniest way, trauma laughter, it's also, I think, one of the most effective ways to not co-opt other people's narratives, because you actually form meaningful relationships in collective work. And I think my number one call to everyone is to everywhere all the time is, if you're not part of an organization or collective doing this work together, then what are you even doing? Now is absolutely the time to learn to work with people across sectors, across types of work. Obviously, the fun thing about climate justice is everything is climate work. And when you start getting involved specifically in intersectional issues, how the stories get told really hinges on what the type of meaningful relationship you have with people. And do you have a relationship of trust where you can share these stories in a way that is the most ethical and the most respectful of people's personal stories, personal histories, and autonomy. And I think for me, that's always been, Avi is much more the storyteller here, but for me, that's always been a big part of how I tell the stories of the work that I'm doing and whose voices we actually prioritize when we're going into a place where we're convincing people about a topic, or we're deciding who's going to be the last speaker at the rally and who's going to tie it all together. That really is about that. And making sure that those stories actually get bumped up whenever we're telling other people's stories. One of the ways actually that really clicked for me about how to tell the stories was actually in land acknowledgements, because I know so many of my friends were just getting so infuriated with land acknowledgements. We're standing on the land that we stole, and that's all. And one of my good pals who does her for her anti-oppression trainings, she always started off her land acknowledgement by giving the acknowledgement of the land that she's on, and then explaining the ways that she as a settler continues to benefit from that land being stolen, and tells a personal story about a current battle that's happening on the territory that they're acknowledging. And how that is a fundamental way that she actually acknowledges that she's not just telling a story of the past about where we are, but how that history is still true right now, and how you can actually choose to either sit back and watch that history become the contemporary reality, or how you can choose to make sure that you don't allow that to repeat itself. And that you immediately decide to choose in everyday actions and kind of robotic responses to kind of acknowledging political moments, that you are choosing liberation every day in all the ways, in all the small ways. So that's always been one of my favorite examples, that I try and think about how we put ourselves in relationship with others and kind of challenge that respective narratives. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just the thing about respecting the ownerships of stories is you have to stress about it all the time if you're a storyteller. It's a very heavy duty and high stakes thing. And I think we just never stop agonizing. First of all, as Maya was saying, and I think as I said earlier, it begins in relationship. It begins in collective work. Sydney, can you hear us okay? You've got a very excellent freeze going. But okay, I'll keep going. The relationship and the collective work is where it begins, and the learning and the humility when you come to learn the story of struggle is something that you just have to bring. And when you have relationships of accountability and collective work, okay, I think Sydney maybe is jumping out and come back in. I'll continue.
Yeah, keep going, Abby. I'll jump in for Sydney.
Cool. That relationships of accountability are really important, because we have to keep each other honest. And if we are fighting for essentially for a world where the principle of creating value is not extraction, in other words, everything that we've been talking about care work being the connective tissue of the economy, of climate justice and a safer future for all, it's about overthrowing the logic of extraction. Right now, the rules of capitalism are everything is a commodity from which to extract value, whether it's people, whether it's land, whether it's stolen land, whether it's people's labor. It's all about extracting maximum value and shoveling that value upwards into the pockets of the people who are already hoarding most of it. If we are fighting that system, then we have to be anti-extractive in the way that we tell stories. And that means earning the right and the trust, if you want to tell a story that is a collective story, through deep work together, collective labor, and relationships of accountability. And when you get it wrong, you find out really quickly, and it's not fun. And you have to then try to make it right. And that's happened to me over and over in my career. And that means that I'm still trying. And I don't think, that just because I have access to a microphone or a camera or a box where it can be projected, that alone gives me a right to tell a story. But I just also want to say that while respecting the ownership of stories is fundamental, that leads to two things. One is, if you have skills as a storyteller, or you have access to places where stories can be distributed, the best case scenario is that you use that access to open doors for people to tell their own stories. And that means skill sharing. That means, spotlight sharing. That means privilege sharing, so that whatever access you have to the storytelling infrastructure, mechanism, tools, right, is put at the service of other people so that they can tell their own stories. And we're seeing, we've seen a flowering of independent media, of storytelling of many different kinds. The social media world has facilitated some of it and kind of like ruined other parts of it. But I do think that, I noticed recently that one of my great heroes, one of the people who worked with us on the Leap Manifesto, Gabriel, who's an indigenous leader, who was a formative figure in what is called the Oka crisis in the 90s, and has been fighting and protecting her land with extraordinary creativity and courage in her community for decades. Let her, sort of list know recently that she's taken up documentary filmmaking. And I was like, yes, that's incredible that an elder, a leader, an inspiring figure like that, who's been in the center of so many struggles, is actually taking the time to learn some of the tools so that she can give us her version unmediated. That's the goal. But the flip side of that, the other part of it is, when there is a storyteller whose kind of trade task it is to tell the story is a relationship. The story is a synthesis of the person who has the stakes and the skin in the game, and the person who has access to the storytelling expertise and distribution. And so all of the movement storytelling that I've done is really like, I try to gently put myself in the story, not as a matter of like trying to take the spotlight, but as full transparency, that part of what you're getting is the result of this person, this community's struggle, and my understanding of it. Just like this webinar is now like a co-production of me and my dog. No, you can't go out. But no, the fact is that we tell each other stories and we build stories together. And when you think about talking to a friend or a comrade, you're building something together collectively in the process of debate, discussion, of storytelling. And like, that is a different kind of story than someone having access to the means so that they can tell their own story. But it's a valid kind of story because it's an honest story. It puts you in the picture in your right place, not the voice of God, not the big storyteller, but the person who is in service of the story that needs to be told. And that's a function that needs to be acknowledged so that all parts of it can be seen. And sometimes something new happens, and real collaboration breaks out, and that can be really cool. Shall I let her out, or should we keep her in here with us? Maybe we'll keep her in for a bit.
Thank you both for your answers. I'm sorry to everyone I cut out for a minute. My internet dropped, a facilitator's worst nightmare. I want to kind of recognize some really amazing insights that I heard from the portions I was here for. From Maya, our last event was on community safety, and so many of the speakers spoke to how important those relationships and networks were for being able to tell stories, and I saw that so reflected in what you were sharing as well. So thank you for highlighting that and bringing that to the surface. Again, reiterating how important relationality and relationships are in telling stories. And as well, Avi, about uplifting voices and building those skills and helping others access that platform when you have that access. Both really amazing answers. So thank you so much. So returning to the Slido, the next upvoted question is, how do we push against co-option of the GND, so the Green New Deal movement, by technocratic elite to propose further extraction and energy colonization? So I'll post that into the chat. And Michael admits that this is a planted question. So we'll start with Maya.
I actually think Avi should start with this one because I know you love going off on this. You've got a
it speaks to work that we're both involved in. One of the projects that we're involved in is a global Green New Deal project. We're partnering with a phenomenal organization called War on Want in the UK, and Maya has been leading this project for the Leap. So I do want to hear your version of it. But basically, the Green New Deal proposals, there have been some in the United States was where this frame kind of came up, and it echoes the New Deal of the 1930s and a time when the government of the United States intervened massively in the economy to put people back to work after the Depression. A lot of the programs of the New Deal built the modern welfare state and also entrenched racism and segregation. Farm workers, many migrant workers, and Black folks in the United States were excluded from these transformative policies, which also, in their best ways, supported the arts. Thousands of plays and murals and public artworks were supported with public money. And it's a model in so many ways for a non-extractive economy that we could build on and make better. And this is a sort of exciting energy behind the Green New Deal. But it's all like, and then there's a European Green New Deal, and there was a Pact for a Green New Deal in Canada. There's lots of different iterations and versions of a Green New Deal. And many of them are repackaging of neoliberal approaches to the climate crisis that will just further entrench colonial supply chains and production practices. And, you know, if you think about it, if everybody in the rich world gets an electric car, we will extract enough lithium from countries like Bolivia to turn them into like craters on the moon. And people who live next to that kind of level of extraction are going to be poisoned and exploited. So do we get to have a great green new future in the rich world at the expense of people in communities in the global south and unleash an extraction frenzy in order to have our zero carbon housing and all our fancy new like electric stuff? We cannot do that. That is like a violation of the fundamental principle of justice that must drive a vision of the Green New Deal. So the global Green New Deal frame that Maya's been doing a lot of work in, and lots of groups around the world have been increasingly turning towards, is a way of putting the world back in the conversation and not seeing the Green New Deal as a function of a privileged nation state. That is not to say that we're not without our responsibility, because those few countries in the world like Canada, the United States, European countries, Australia, New Zealand, we have the capacity to print our own currency. We have sovereign currencies. We're not enchained by debt from rich countries that will provoke hyperinflation crises if we try to get out from under our debts. And that takes up all of the industrial capacity of our country just servicing the damn debt instead of providing healthcare for our country. So we have a few countries on earth that have the privilege of being rich, having strong industrial bases, and having sovereign currencies that must transfer massive wealth and resources and technology to the rest of the world so that everybody can have a Green New Deal. And that kind of frame of global reparations, of global repair, and of thinking about the global consequences of environmental policies in the rich world, that is now the cutting edge of the climate justice conversation. And it's kind of like a relief to have the rest of the world back in the frame. And Maya, like you've been working with the War on Want folks, but also with all of these super smart people, you know, grounded in movements around the world who have been, you know, needing to scream about this. And I think our job is to make sure that people in the North listen a lot more.
Mm-hmm. And the Global Green New Deal framework that was a really excellent backstory and leveling Epi. The methodology that we've been working with is how do we set up a series of involved and participatory roundtables where we can actually have experts at all these deep intersections of the ways in which we don't want the Green New Deal framework to actually be co-opted and to become, you know, colonization 2.0. And actually make sure that all those voices are taken into account so that we can start to collectively draft the policy frameworks that are going to need to create the guardrails for those conversations. So when we're going into the climate talks, when we're going into the COP, when we're going into the inside outside game of the G20 and the G7s and the World Trade Organization meetings, and when movements are gearing up to face those and lay out their demands, can we actually reignite the spirit of internationalism by making sure that we're all wearing the same T-shirt, as I'm liking to say right now, because it will only work if we actually all are saying the same thing. And so part of this campaign was not only about creating actual spaces for people to have real life conversations with each other and actually start to have negotiations and debates, and where we could actually bring the public into those conversations and say, like, these are the type of conversations we need to be having about how we create an international policy roadmap and how we actually take those demands back at home domestically and start working on the legislation and the calls to action and the movement supports that are going to be needed to popularize those solutions. But also about taking the stories of what's happening in the world right now and actually bringing them together and showing the way that that struggle is the exact same thing. So one of the things that we've been thinking about doing, for example, along this vein of care work and about big agribusiness, is the farmers' protests in India, the largest protests of their kind in the world ever. There's millions upon millions, hundreds of millions, I'm pretty sure, people camped outside, marching on cities, not marching to cities, marching on cities. That's how many people there are, demanding that corporations get out of the farmlands and actually bring it back into the ownership of people. It's a huge group of people that are participating in this are, folks talking about workers' rights, unions, and the coordination that's going into that is just tremendous. And we're saying, like, how is that connected to the marches against the police all across the Americas? How is that connected to the revolution that happened in Chile on the eve of COP25, so much so that it had to be moved to Madrid because the price of bus fare went up because the buses were electrified, but people had been so poor for so long that amount of money for a green solution got downloaded onto poor people. And then you have a revolution that ends up with the Constitution being rewritten. How is that connected to the protests that are happening in Asia or connected to the protests happening in America? And how can we actually have conversations with each other, the movement folks and also the policy folks, and actually get on side about what those demands should look like? Because ultimately the solutions that we're actually talking about surfacing are Green New Deal solutions, but we're not calling those by name. And so what would it look like to actually have strategy sessions together? What would it look like to take case studies of how people mobilized and talk about, like, what policy solutions are you demanding and how do we normalize them? And how do we replicate them? And so that's the really exciting thing that's happening with the Global Green New Deal. And the part that we're participating in largely is about that storytelling part. How do we make those stories common sense for people? How do people look on the news and watch the protests in India and go, that's the exact same thing I marched in the streets for in July and June of 2020. Yeah.
Wow, again, thank you both so much for your insightful answers. It sounds like such an amazing methodology to bring together all of these intersecting stories, find those intersection points and turn them into policy solutions. I think that speaks to such a powerful and effective way of using storytelling directly for change. So with this kind of last question that we just asked, we're going to end the Q&A portion and we're going to move into closing, looking at the time. So just as a final question, I want to ask you both, are there any calls to action that you have related to the different projects you're working on or that you're aware of that you would like others in the space to be aware of as well? So I'll hand it off to whoever wants to start, I guess, if you have a strong preference.
Maya, will you go while I look something up?
Yeah, totally.
Transparency, folks.
Something that I think people should get involved in right now, obviously along with the Status for All call. So log on to migrantrights.ca and sign up for the Status for All campaign and look at things you can do in your community and calls to action you can participate in. There is a crisis of long-term care in this country, and it's a climate crisis. And we've been working in relationship with a broad series of organizations talking about how we actually bring the crisis of long-term care into the recovery model, because there was a crisis in long-term care long before the pandemic hit. People entering long-term care facilities in this country's average life expectancy was 18 months, and that has obviously already largely gone down. But privatized healthcare in Canada was an epidemic before this pandemic. And we actually need to really talk about what it would look like to have public healthcare in this country again and give everybody access to it. And fundamentally, that actually means taking private for-profit facilities and bringing them into the public ownership, making the federal governments the landlords and bringing the running of those facilities into the provincial health authorities, and making sure that every single person has absolutely free, taxpayer funded, obviously, access to healthcare. And that should be part of our COVID recovery. And I think like, as there's a lot of organizations working on it, I would look up your local provincial healthcare coalition and look at the unions that are representing largely impoverished and largely racialized workers who are working in these facilities, because they have had the most robust calls to action for a very long time. But this movement is gaining speed. There's Doctors for Long-Term Care, which is launching a very beautiful campaign, and there are national days of action coming. And this is a really good example, as Evie was talking about the stories we can tell about what the future looked like. When you look at what it would look like to implement Green New Deal policies, one of the big foundational blocks will be healthcare. And as the vaccine comes into play and people go, this will be solved soon, no need to worry about it, it's good to remember that we actually have a really small window to really popularize this demand and really whip up concern about it. And so, yeah, that would be something that we're working on right now that I would really encourage people to look at wherever you are right now. Get involved.
Amazing.
Abby, over
well,
to
you're
you.
just you're so good at the call to action that I feel really rallied by that. I wanted to more than a call to action, maybe just drop a few breadcrumbs. I'll throw it in the chat, the link for an event that we're participating in. It's a book launch about the global Green New Deal, and it's a phenomenal book that is going to be co-published by the Leap and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And I'm speaking at the launch with a really cool panel, including the legendary Harsha Walia, whom I hope many people in this space are well familiar with. But the book it'll be a very international panel, and the book is filled with perspectives from movement thinkers and intellectuals from the global South that really puts a lot of detail in the vision of the global Green New Deal and a nice framework for seeing the whole thing in its various pillars. It's not exactly the same as the project that Maya and I are working on with War on Want, but there's so much overlap in these efforts, and they're very aligned. So rather than a call to action, it's like a call to webinar, call to book launch, CTBL. But I do think it'll be a really interesting event.
That sounds amazing. And call to webinar is also a call to action, learning some more different channels to get involved in some of these processes, deeper dive from this space. Thank you guys so much for your calls to action. We will be compiling them and sending them to every participant in this space as well. So if you're in this room and you want to know more about some of the items mentioned today, we will be providing them to you. So with that, I will turn it back to Michael. Thank you both for everything you have illuminated for us tonight.
Thanks, Sydney.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sydney. And thanks so much, Maya and Avi, for joining us this evening. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege to have you both share so eloquently some of the work that you've been involved in. So thanks for all you do in uniting the struggles, in building this intersectional movement. It's so desperately needed, and for creating such an amazing space, artistic space as well. So we all look forward to all the things Leap does in the future, all the things you two do probably outside of the Leap, and all the things that the movement becomes in the years to come. So for those who are still here, thanks for sticking it out till the bitter end. Just really quickly, I wanted to mention that we have another event in 2 weeks on hidden histories and the importance of hidden histories in surfacing the past so we can create new futures. So we'll have Ronnie Dean Harris from Musqueam sharing some historical bundles about Musqueam history, as well as Imogen Lim from Vancouver Island University sharing about and uncovering the historical Chinese Canadian community on Vancouver Island and the importance that plays in now and in our social justice futures together. So thanks all for coming, and I hope you have a really wonderful evening. Good night.